Hey everyone, we're back with another episode of the Edge podcast for CHROs. My name is Varun. I've got Nisha, my co-host, and tonight our guest is Vikas Dua. Before I go a little deep into who Vikas is and what this podcast is going to be about, this is our eighth episode, and so let me give you a quick background of what we discussed in the last episode with Richard Lobo, who was the executive vice president and head human resources of Infosys. So essentially, with him, the trend that we sort of me and Nisha have been seeing is that a lot of these millennials and a lot of these Gen Z startup folks who initially left, who was this mass exodus, right, of actually going from IT organizations to actually startups and to these, high growth stage startups, right? Now the thing is happening that all of these guys are again flocking back to the IT organizations, and so Infosys and a lot of these companies are trying to strategize. Hey, how do we attract the new millennial workforce? What are the future of jobs are going to look like in these places? And essentially, how does leadership in itself view reskilling, and what are the top skills that both employees and leaders need to have? And essentially, we also covered, hey, what is the ROI going to be versus, reskilling somebody and actually hiring somebody at low cost to company, right? So we discussed all these pressing questions, and we also had a very fun, last, I think, 5-10 minute session where we built a live playbook with them. So be sure to check that out. So about Vikas, right? So Vikas is an HR professional with high value experience in the domain, having worked with both startups and large companies like Wipro and Concentrix, driving HR in the APAC region. He has been instrumental in building careers for over 120K individuals across levels. Currently, he leads the HR function across India for IPG DXTRA, part of the Interpublic Group, which is listed on the New York Stock Exchange as IPG, the world's leading marketing communications company. In his community serving avatar, he's also actively involved as a mentor and advisor to associations like BRICS Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Federation of World Academics, and multiple HR tech startups. He's also an author of the book called HR in My Heart that combines prose and poetry to present lessons in the leadership in a very distinctive style. He's also a TEDx speaker and a blogger on HR practices and shares his learning under his self-designed HR in My Heart brand umbrella. I think because you're wearing that shirt as well, it looks pretty cool. Yeah, see, that's a logo. So be sure to look out for that one. His articles are regularly featured in leading magazines in the HR and management domain, and he has the distinction of being one of the first Asian voices on the US headquartered and globally recognized talent culture World of Work blog, a leading global community of thought leaders in the world of business. Because this is brilliant, could you also introduce yourself to the audience as well? I think everyone's excited to hear about you.
Hey, thank you so much, Varun and Nisha, for having me. And I think those are, of course, great words and very flowery words that you shared. But at the core of it, I'm a product of corporate India, seen the rise of the IT BPO space for the last 15 plus years, and been happy to be part of that growth. And now experiencing a stage where I'm actually trying to give back to the community in very different ways. That's really what I'm doing currently.
That's nice, Nisha. But why don't you welcome our guests as well? I think you and Vikas go way back, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Vikas. Vikas and I have had some fun conversations actually, and um, every time I've learned a lot from you, Vikas, and it's been a lot of fun. So thank you actually for joining us today. And shall we get right in, Varun? Shall we start asking
Yeah,
Vikas
let me actually give
all the
uh,
questions?
My pleasure.
right. Let me just quickly give our audience the premise of this episode. So CHROs are usually the least likely to become the next CEOs, and on parallel lines, very few CEOs actually gain experience in the people part of the organization. So we're trying to explore gaps and dig insights on transforming the HR delivery model to drive higher engagement, talent management, and organizational change essentially. So Nisha, I'll let you lead today.
Sure. So because actually, when Varun and I were thinking about this particular episode, at least, we were thinking about this, right? And Varun hinted at it just now, that why is it, right? Why is it that HR has never been, a serious business function? Why is it that, even a CHRO, like you at the most become a CHRO, but we've never seen a CHRO transition to a CEO, right? So
Correct.
while HR actually drives a lot of business needs, and while the HR function itself has its own budgets, it has never really been a part of organizational P&L to a very large extent. So what is the reason that you attribute to this, Vikas? And that's just one part of the question. We need to also think of solutions, but let's really understand what the problem is.
Sure. So, Nisha, very interesting question, I think, and I have some theories about it. Having, like I said, having spent almost 2 decades in an industry like the IT BPO space, where really it's all been about people. It's been a services space, and the raw material, as we used to refer to it in that space, was manpower, right? So, and in that space itself, HR heads, HR practitioners have a tremendous value, but at the same time, like you rightly pointed out, how many did end up becoming CEOs? Literally, even if you Google it out, very difficult to get hard names. So that's the real tragedy. And the fact of the matter is not that HR practitioners have not looked at the bottom line, have not looked at ROI. Some of the terms that I heard, Varun also using. The reality is that in the last 5 years, especially, or even maybe if I go back even 10 years, every HR intervention that has been deployed, at least in some of the larger, more evolved workplaces, has had to have an ROI. No CFO, CEO has signed off on interventions which did not have a clear ROI projection. And the reason for that was very simple. We've seen that whatever gains India had post liberalization, the great bull run, all of that kind of with 2008, which Lehman, there was a reset that happened, and post that organizations became extremely cautious, and to that extent HR was not saved as well, or not covered as well. And all of us who were in that space, who happen to be in that space, have understood the importance of preserving every dollar, right? The change or the challenge that I foresee, or I have observed, where HR heads have not been able to transition and move on to the CEO seat, is primarily because somewhere I think the growth path that most of the HR professionals have taken has been the same standard growth. What do I mean by that? For the most part, most HR professionals will start off with having acquired the qualification, the knowledge, the certification in HR from a recommended or a desired institute. And then once they get into that HR track, then they travel vertically upwards through the HR framework with a little bit of exposure towards different elements. Like, for example, you spend a few years in recruitment, a couple of years in HR business partner role. Some may try and move towards the L&D side of HR. A few may even go down and look at compensation and benefits. But by and large, what ends up happening is that the HR professional tends to kind of follow this one vertical path upwards. And while it is nice to say, and one would like to believe that that HR professional has managed to assimilate, managed to get the business perspective, managed to understand different elements of the business, that invariably doesn't happen unless you really dirty your hands. And I think that's what makes that move very challenging, because you do get somewhere constrained in your thought process, in your outlook, because you've really seen an important part but a limited part of the business operation. And unless you're able to look at all elements of the business operation and understand where the value is being created for the end customer, what is that customer going to pay for, what are the different elements impacting that, very difficult to fit in and do justice to the CEO seat. So that's what I believe.
Very interesting stuff. So actually, this is a pretty good segue to the next thing that I had in mind to ask you. So for true business HR transformation to happen, we also, sort of have this hypothesis that the modern CHRO and the business HR should have real authority over hiring and firing, like take the absolute decision on it. If the actual decision remains sort of with managers, in the actual way that the spending decisions are taken by the budget owners rather than being dictated by the finance function. So on similar lines, do you think that the business HR, should they be held accountable for using metrics like year on year skill development, capability gaps, engagement, and attrition? And so what are your thoughts on this?
So I think increasingly that is how industry's also been moving last few years, Varun. The fact of the matter is that in our organizations, and the way I think inherently human beings are designed, we don't like change, and that leads to what one sees as favoritism or bias in the workplace amongst the workforce, right? So when you have, for example, a head of sales who moves from one organization to another, you often find that in the next quarter, two or three of her top performing direct reports have also moved to that other organization as well. And that's where you understand that the organization has not been really operating on what one would say performance related parameters, but on person related systems. That's why what we did in one of the previous organizations, large organizations, IT space that I worked with, is what we involved HR in the appraisal system much more deeply. And what we did was that uh, in the case of each and every employee, the final rating that was designed or awarded by the manager had to be signed off by the HR business partner for that particular function or business unit. Now, was it a perfect approach? Not really. I'll tell you why. Because in some cases it worked well, in some cases it didn't. Where did it fail? It failed in cases where the HR business partner took a slightly, you can say, distant approach and went with whatever ratings the business manager decided to allot his or her team. Where it worked well was where the HR practitioner was more took more ownership, went deeper into the analysis, went and questioned the manager on why each particular rating, or within each rating, why each parameter was rated the way it was. So again, it required the HR function leaders and the, of course, the actual practitioners on the ground to take that ownership, take that control, and make sure that they really participated and made that rating evaluation a three-way process. Having said that, I think, like I said, it's not a perfect approach. It did have its merits, probably better than the previous unilateral approach for sure. But going forward, what I think is going to be more important is a more standardized approach, which involves not only these three parties, but an assessment, a 360-degree kind of appraisal, which is inbuilt. Importantly, also a process which makes sure that this whole performance management happens on an ongoing basis rather than annually or biannually or even quarterly, because we've also seen that business cycles are now so volatile that you can't wait for half a year to go by and start having conversation around performance or how individuals need to upgrade themselves or do something differently, right? So that's where this ongoing engagement will become important again. That's an area where I'm mentoring a startup which is working very closely with organizations to solve this particular area, because this is like, to your question, one of the most critical elements of making sure that organizations and HR teams get more deeply aligned and actually able to be symbiotic in sense of solving problems for each other. And it's only then that the metrics that you spoke about will be really owned by HR as well. Today what ends up happening in more cases than not is that you have HR defining the policy and operations of the other units having to implement those policies. uh, as any logical person would say, that is not exactly desirable, not exactly going to be the one that will create a workforce or a workplace that is positive, encourages collaboration and so on. So again, in my own personal experience, an organization where the HR business partner owns up to the unit's attrition as much as the owner of that business unit, is the one that is likely to be able to reduce its attrition figures, likely to be able to increase engagement on the floor and so on. So it has to be a symbiotic partnership approach for sure, with HR having skin in the game, no doubt about it.
I appreciate the phrase that you use, the skin in the game. So, but then I also feel that there should be some level of disconnect, between the broader aspect of what the HR needs to do, like you spoke, versus the day-to-day operations. So, how do they? Okay, let's say that there's a team of just three people, and there's a team of 10, 20, and all of these people, right? Various sizes. How do you think they should divide, or balance day-to-day versus the broader thinking?
So in this symbiotic relationship, Varun, what will eventually happen is that once, let's say, HR, and that would typically be the route as well, define the policies or the frameworks under which the people have to operate. The business would need to actually implement but also at the same time make sure that the right feedback, the appropriate signals are flowing back into HR, so that that policy can be further tightened, improved, or even done away with if it's found to be not appropriate. At the same time, uh, HR needs to be able to keep that policing hat on while ensuring that the defined policies have been implemented in the right manner with the right sensitivity, so that the said objective has a decent chance of being met. So again, I come back to the term partnership, because until you have that, traditionally what has ended up happening is that, and this is taking this conversation right to the top, where Nisha brought about that perspective very beautifully. uh, HR was always seen as a so-called support function, and in one sense, organization of leaders being of equals, it was still considered that the HR person was one level below, because it was non-revenue generating. But that cannot be the mindset in 2021 and beyond, clearly, because until the two partner and join hands and work together, uh, the way forward is going to be extremely rocky for all participants.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it right, Vikas, because what I wanted to ask you next, especially because we're talking about 2021 and all that we have seen from 2020, right? That, everybody we have spoken to so far has said that this has been actually the year of the CHRO, right? The 2 years of the CHRO, rather, because it seems like the CHRO suddenly has, I mean, while they figured themselves and their teams out, they had to literally also figure out how the organization was going, how are they going to keep their people happy, morale up. I mean, you name it, right? So from here, where do you see the CHRO going? I mean, I had another question for you, but since you mentioned 2021, I just kind of segued to this. But there's another segment that I wanted to kind of cover. But if we can just get into, where do you see the CHRO going from here, right? If we can just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So you said it correctly, Nisha. I think for the longest time, we in HR used to talk about letting HR get the seat at the table, and that used to be something that we heard at all the HR conferences, and it was beaten to death. It took a pandemic to change that. The HR head not only got a seat at the table, he actually got the hot seat. And the moment we had the first case of the national lockdown last year, 2020 March, and the CEO picked up the phone, dialed the HR head, because that's the person he needed to discuss and get things moving with, whether it was shutting down the workplace, or making sure the business operations are not impacted. And then through and through, where we've gone through the various cycles in different ways in different states. Some call it lockdown, some curfew, some shutdown, and it's almost on a weekly basis that policies, procedures have been changing. And what has happened as a result of that is that, of course, HR is now at a broader level looked at in a different light. People do value the hard work that HR people have put in over the last 12 plus months. uh, and going forward, it has also enabled HR folks, including HRO heads, to actually become more external facing, look more outside the organization than within. Because earlier, to some extent, I think the worldview seemed to be limited to the internal employees, making sure that they were fine, and the external view was limited to the extent of where is the talent pool, what does it cost, how much time will it take me to hunt down the talent and get them to join the organization. Today it goes much more beyond, in trying to understand the policies that are going to impact the business, the regulations that are going to impact employees, including providing support to them in their hour of need, as we've seen in the last few months, helping them and their family navigate the cruel pandemic. So the HR head is now really kind of looking more outside, and from that, trying to work inside and trying to take the organization forward. Will this be enough to get that HR head the CEO seat? Maybe not, in my view. There's still some work to be done in that front. If that is something that you were alluding to.
Actually, I was wanting to allude to something a little different. It's a step back instead of forward, right? Do you think, and this has always kind of, this question has always been on my mind, right? So a CEO, at least erstwhile, things have changed a lot, but required a management degree, and with an MBA, you could become a CEO. And similarly, HR also has an MBA, even the most coveted of institutions do offer that kind of an MBA for HR, right? um, Despite a lot of CHROs having that coveted MBA, having a lot of that thing, how is it that, why is it, do you think, that they still don't have the seat on the table, but the hot seat instead?
True. So, Nisha, I think the reason for that again comes back to the coverage of the traditional HR leader, the scope and scale that he or she has adopted and uh, chosen, as you can say, the area of operating for himself or herself. To get the seat at the table, what has been obviously important over the years is to be seen as someone who really is able to drive business with a view on the bottom line, right? And that's where it is ironical, to a large extent. HR professionals have found themselves to be in a very unique spot, find themselves in a middle of a dichotomy where employees tend to feel that the HR always tends to take the side of the leadership, because when appraisals come around or salary hikes come around, they go by the financial budgets which are allotted to them, and then they work downwards with that and define the percentage hikes and so on and so forth. The business leaders, on the other hand, have always felt that HR is very people friendly and wants to engage with them and make life comfortable for them. So they are supporting the employees and not really business per se. But having said that, now HR heads, because again, coming back to the recent times, having had to look at the business operations in very different light, are maybe somewhere a step closer to getting that seat on the table, because now they understand the value of whether do we need that real estate for our office, that fancy building in the middle of cyber hub, or do you think it's a better approach to make it part remote, part work from office kind of engagement? Do they appreciate the need of having their employees and their teams better equipped with new technology that can support some of the remote work? So all of those experiences have actually opened up the worldview, and many HR leaders have managed to make that transition to understand the importance of all this, how all of these different pieces fit in that puzzle, and how that actually impacts the bottom line. So I think they're definitely closer there, and because of the fact that again they've helped their people with the human approach, I think that seat will come with a little bit more respect for sure, and appreciation, because I know for a fact personally, so many of us in the fraternity have gone that extra mile to help our teams, uh, whether it is organizing oxygen for their family members, or helping them with an ambulance, or whatever you call it. So that's something that will definitely happen for sure now.
I entirely agree with this. In fact, I've sort of firsthand seen this happen with my own organization as well. The kind of, I mean, see, there is one, and that's all right. I think again, this is a very personal opinion. What I feel that I think the legitimacy of an HR's role lies in taking the best judgment calls possible for your people. And while it's pretty nice to have fancy offices and design fancy perks and everything, I think when it especially keeping the context of the current times that we're in, the kind of HRs who've taken the decision to actually provide better insurance, better on-ground facility for, let's say, oxygen, for hospital beds, for anything that any employee might need in any geography that they're in. I think taking judgment calls on those front will really, make them really stick out as a, very holistic leader, I feel. So I've got like a, I wouldn't say a question, but this is a thought, right? You mentioned that HR leaders are now more external facing, and that they need, and they're sort of, their own worldview has sort of been expanding in multiple ways, right? Especially because of the pandemic and because of the possibility of borderless workforce and a bunch of these things. But then, okay, so here are two things that I feel are sort of maxims when it comes to the two roles of CEO and CHRO. CEOs are normally, let's say, the complete principal owner of a strategy, and CHROs are essentially, owners of the human capital.
Right.
But for a strategy to work, I need predictability at the very basic of the basic thing. Hey, do I know what my attrition rate is? Can I predict, is my attrition rate at par with the industry, or is it below? Is it better? Is it, what exactly is it? Second, succession planning. How good am I with it? Third, with my own employees, growth in the company. Hey, how long will this guy take from going from X role to Y role? Can we reduce it? So, probably we can upskill them better, or can we coach them better? Can we turn our managers into coaches, and a bunch of these things, right? Uh, do you think if there are certain tools and templates that modern CHROs can use, right? Do you think that this predictability might become easier? So I think once this predictability becomes easier, then the HR can say, hey, I exactly know the inflow and the outflow. I can contract and expand the supply demand as I want to. And basis this, if I've got the right people there, of course, my organization is going to reach, the level of the world, right? What do you think about this?
Sure, Varun. So, great question. Now, again, multiple facets to it. I'll try and throw some light
Yeah,
on what
let's,
I
yeah.
understand of this. Fact of the matter is, again, it will vary differently from industry to industry, business, size of the organization, and so on. One of the things that we struggled in the services space, the IT recruitment, BPO space over the years is the fact that, again, like I said, we were dealing with human beings as the raw material, right? And it's unlike producing, let's say, gears for a car or thermometers, because on a production line like that you can actually really determine how many tons of raw material you will need for what output, and how many thermometers you'll be able to produce from that glass that you have, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to human beings, it's completely understandable that each one comes with his own idiosyncrasies, and therefore you need to really plan only for let's say a baseline or an average as per past trends and so on. And that's where the whole game lies. But what I've experienced over the years also is that even the largest of companies have been successful, and I've worked with even Wipro, where the workforce at that point was almost close to 200,000 globally. And the fact is that you really need to build in platforms, uh, processes, systems that are able to support your scale, because the fundamentals remain the same irrespective of what size or what industry or business you're in. And once you grow, once you scale, the only thing that can help you is if you manage to define the right processes and systems, and deploy the right tools and technology to empower your people, sorry. So increasingly, thanks to again the rapid development we've had in the tech space last 5 odd years, it's not something that is rocket science. There's technology, the platforms available, many off the shelf, many customizable, that the organization can deploy. The only thing it needs is, of course, leadership which is conversant with the new changes that are happening, willing to take calculated calls, willing to invest in understanding some of these tools that are available to them, and working internally with the concerned people who are impacted by them or who will use them to deploy and start benefiting from the same. And I'll give you a simple example when it comes to recruiting for a call center profile, for example, which is in the business, one of the, you can say, the entry level roles, one of the simplest roles to hire for. But even that role, if you look at it, an agent who's sitting on the shop floor taking a call from customer care would possibly have 50 different variables impacting that work that he or she delivers. It can range from age, gender, education, which city or town they came from, what is their level of English communication, what level of technical knowledge or awareness they have, and so on and so forth. So there could be 50 such different parameters. within each of this, for example, education, there could be an element of, is that person a 10th pass, a 12th pass, is that person a graduate, if a graduate, in which particular discipline. So there's just too many variables, and it's impossible to look at any trends, look at any analysis insight without having the right technology tools at your disposal. So that's what my guidance is whenever someone is looking at deploying such tools or technologies, is that really look at the problem you're trying to solve and then go down straight to the root. Because often, and what I term this is, don't just remix, reinvent. The reason I say that is, most of the time when we are scaling up, we just kind of move Excel to a Python code to the next level. We don't really go down and question whether the Excel spreadsheet was made in the right manner or not. What was it? Is it justified for the new age that we're in? And we just kind of paint it, dress it up a bit, and try and update it and say that we've reinvented when we actually haven't. So that's the thought that I would like to share here.
I think, because you and I had once spoken about this as well, right? That, you know, adopting technology in an organization, especially for an HR, it is such a difficult thing to do because a lot of it comes forced fitted to some extent, right? It's never personalized to the organization. And at that point, I remember we had this very interesting discussion, and I keep coming back to it. um, and it has such an amazing parallel, which is of customer experience, right? And when I recently spoke to even product managers, I think, they all kind of mentioned that the one thing that will define, or the one thing that people will take for granted, let's say, is customer experience in the future. While that to some extent is trump card for some people today, it's never going to be trump card in the future. It's going to be a given. So what are your thoughts about customer experience? And if customer experience is a given, what will be like the A standard then, in an organization, and how can HR kind of improve their game in that kind of a situation?
So Nisha, customer experience is non-negotiable, right? You said it. I think like you said, we had this conversation earlier as well, and we know classic examples where market leaders are in that position, frankly, because they've just put the customer first. And increasingly, I think organizations are also beginning to realize many more now than a few years ago, that the first customer really for them is really their employee. And I think that focus towards the employees picked up on a big way. I think the real transformation that will happen, and that is imperative at some point, it will kick in, though very, very early days, I would say, at this point, is when most of this happens predictively rather than reactively. So, in the classic case of the recent months, has the HR function, or has even the business managed to predict that, yes, India might experience a second wave, which would disrupt employees to a level that it has? And if so, what are the steps that they've taken proactively to ensure that when the second wave came, they were less impacted than maybe their colleagues in other companies, and so on and so forth. So that's what can be a real game changer. If employees have found their HR teams, their managers to be sleeping, not having anticipated the recent wave, uh, it is obviously having is going to have very, very negative consequences, because that really means that somewhere that trust factor, which really binds employees to workplaces, would have got impacted in a huge way. So when it comes to the future, I think predicting what your customer needs, what your employees' desires are, what the market is going to look like, a combination of all that is something that leaders will have to look at in order to make sure that they are able to be on top when that actual event happens or that change comes in.
So basically, to sort of sum the last couple of points up, what I feel is that remixing tools and throwing tools and people at the problem doesn't really do any good to anybody. I think it makes more sense to think from first principles, right? Hey, if I've got, let's say, for example, if we take the case of simple goal setting itself, which has sort of become very prominent right now because every organization at this moment expects their employees to take the lead by themselves in some way or the other. That, hey, I'm not going to micromanage. We set a process. These are the goals of the quarter. You drill them down to your weekly and daily deliverables and report async. That's it. You do that. And so what the tools could probably go here. Let's say that if, I mean, I can definitely see the difference that's happening in SaaS space, but let's say if this was probably in a traditional manufacturing area where the manager is probably working home, but then everybody else is just on ground. How does reporting happen there, for example? So everywhere you can't just copy each other and say, hey, look, this is what I'm going to do, because everybody's variables are so different, right? So because one of the last questions that sort of I really want to sort of end this wonderful conversation with was that, hey, how do we turn this into a more PNL oriented role? I mean, we know that, hey, tools or again could either happen by just reorganizing people within your or another form of tooling could actually be having another monitoring tool or some sort of thing in place. It could be anything, right? So how do you turn that into a more P&L role, that, hey, at the end of the day, this is the investment that you've done, how do I justify this investment then?
Sure. So, to a large extent, I think that shift has already happened, and for the most part, most of the proactive leaders are already in that zone where they understand. And thankfully, again, the recent years, the kind of product we've seen coming out of the business schools has been very number and tech savvy, if I might say it that way. Also, very forward thinking, strategic in their approach. I think the little bit which I still see missing, and I think that separates the real so-called CEOs from the practitioners who may not enter have that seat, is the fact that they're able to leverage not only their business skills and knowledge, the financial, the operational, the people skills, and all of that, but also able to leverage their ability to network, to build connections, to develop their personal brand and become sort of, you can say, a front face for the organization. And increasingly, if you look at the topmost brands across the globe today, uh, somewhere you'll find it impossible to delink the CEO face from the brand, from the organization. And I think that's what you see as being very transformational. So but today, a CEO moving from one organization to another is also seen as someone who can actually pull in business for that new organization just by virtue of his or her connections. So it's not only the ability to run the business, to manage the P&L, but also the ability to grow and build that business through one's own network and persona. I think that's the true shift that's emerging and should actually be encouraged in whatever capacity one can.
I think that's only because, to some extent, a CEO is no longer just a corporate face, right? The CEO is a founder in most cases with skin in the game. I mean, I think that's the phrase of today's chat. But uh, because of the startups and things like that coming up, the CEO is the founder. So obviously, that founder is going to be vested, will have the network, will grow the business. I think that's the way we're all looking at the CEO, which is perhaps one of the
True.
reasons why the CHRO doesn't really in such an organization may not really, or the chief people officer, I've been hearing that phrase a lot in unicorns. So that's what I'm hearing, like,
True.
they call them chief people officers, and while they really care for the people, the buck still stops with the founder,
Yeah.
unless it's the CPO who's founding another startup and then becoming the CEO as well. So with this whole startups thing also coming up, I think it's going to change how even legacy organizations are going to work to
True.
some extent, I believe.
True.
In fact, I was so we're going a little off track here, but I was I'm just adding to extrapolating Vikas's last point. So I was reading this. I was actually reading this a couple of articles a couple of days back, and then I was writing this one draft yesterday, which I'll publish today as well. I'll share that with everyone as well too. In the US, right back in the 90s, Patels, the actual Gujarati people of
Mm.
proper hardcore Gujarat. I'm saying not the ones who've distributed themselves across India, the actual indigenous people. These guys migrated to the US, right? They started owning motels over there. So Nirasha, this is a pretty wonderful story actually that I'll tell you more about later as well. So these guys migrated to the US in the 90s with the objective, hey, I want a better life. Why don't I start a business here? And these guys start buying motels over there. And motels are basically normal lodges, right? Not a lot of again fancy stuff there. Good money. You have people coming here and there, minimal communication skills. And the Gujaratis or thing with any Indian for that matter is that we have two things that I think nobody else in the world has. One, hospitality,
Right.
the kind of hospitality that we provide, nothing like it. Two, the kind of culture that we have in terms of, hey, if I've got this, or frugality, I would say frugality is a very important element within us. So these guys, they pulled in a bunch of their cousins, they pulled in a bunch of their family members, cash reserves, they got in one place, and they start putting down payments across different localities. And fast forward to today, these guys, more than 50% of the entire, hotel chain industry represented by Gujaratis in the US. And these guys collectively are less than, I think, 2% of the entire US population. And if you look at India or you look at any other part as well, right? You have a certain ethnic group, Malayalis, who are pretty great at having supermarkets, sorry,
Yeah.
across Middle East and across various parts of India as well. You've got various ethnic groups doing this. Now in the modern world, you don't have to physically move to a certain land of opportunity, right? Your internet has become the land of opportunity.
Correct.
And when you mentioned Vikas about this being a brand, right? The internet is your land of opportunity if I'm the brand, right?
True.
If I'm also virtue signaling to people similar to me, let's say if I'm me and Nisha have this podcast or CHRs, we're also signaling to people like you, to other CEOs, to HRs, to everybody out there. So we're building our own distribution chain, our own community, our own people who identify with each other. And the self-expression plus the kind of consumption that's happening, if you sort of draw the inflection point of both, right, the inflection point is the business value that is actually being created. So what I'm trying to say is that I think the point that you made, I think is one of the biggest takeaways, that while people think that is theoretical, but the moment you start putting this into action, the moment you become authority to yourself, the moment you have your own band of trusted people that you can sort of bring along with you as you go from your own one org to another
True.
org, you will not just bring your own, I mean, impact your own personal brand as well, but into the entire org too, because your turnaround times naturally become that faster
Yeah.
because you already have your own trusted people. And this is exactly what's happening with the entire influencer space as well. These 12-year-olds, 18-year-olds, these guys, what I've noticed are these guys are becoming like top influencers across Twitter here and there. And the kind of people that they're happening, they're kind of bringing us similar consumers who have there, similar people who want to lead a similar lifestyles. And brands are like, hey, all this is happening, and we just slowly sell our products too.
Yeah.
And right, and this is, I think this is one of the most brilliant things which I've also personally experienced, because back Nisha, I don't think I told you this as well. So back when I was again starting up, right, back when I was in college as well, I used to also be this LinkedIn influencer, and I used to do a lot of these things. And my prime thing was, hey, one thing that's going to, of course, do a lot of legion for myself too, to being a brand, being as this fabled poster boy child sort of thing there, that would also attract a lot of people who would want to do their first stints with me.
Yeah.
Which, as a CEO that I was, it was much easier for me to also bring down costs, automatically drive this economic engine of hiring and all those people as well, and also bring in partners. And I can firsthand like sort of path choose this. Nisha, what is your experience? Have you had an experience around this as well,
I think in my role
like
as,
being a personal brand?
yeah, of course, I think it's very important, and I think um, there's a way we can extrapolate it as well in this conversation, right? In my role as community lead or PR, when I started off with being a PR professional, this wasn't really a thing, right? Because it was all about the organization that we were representing, but eventually it became about us more than the organization we were representing, because it
Mm.
became, how creative we were was how creative the organization was supposed to be. Hence we had to do a lot of things to kind of get ourselves out there. And I think it has a similar thing for the CHRO as well, right? While there are a lot of CHRO conferences and there's a lot for the CHRO, I think the what probably has been missing, and maybe we can leave that as a final thought for our audience, is how can a CHRO become a brand, right? How can they become influencers that become popular? Instead, the organization by the founder or the CEO. Would you know the organization by the CHRO? Or
Yeah.
the CPO, the Chief People Officer. So, maybe Vikas, your last words, and then we can get done.
Yeah, in fact, that would be a great feeling as an HR professional if that day were to come soon, because I know for a fact that many HR leaders and some of them are doing a fabulous job in this space, which actually works very well for the organization as well in terms of attracting talent and helping the organization's brand also flower. So I think it's a win-win situation on both accounts, and it'll be a lovely day if that were to happen soon.
In fact, I think to our listeners as well, I think Vikas is like a standing testament to everything that we've discussed in the last 15 minutes. I mean, he's a TEDx speaker. He's written a book. He has his own brand as well. And I think, and given the entire span that Vikas has had, I mean, he's again. Let me reiterate what I initially said when I was introducing him. He's influenced the HR careers of more than 120,000 individuals, and so you're actually getting that. Hey, look, this is the investment that he done, and this is the ROI that happened as an individual brand. Now imagine if the company could actually make this a thing that, hey, we want to continuously attract this talent of people who are personal brands across levels. We've got a marketing influencer, we've got an influencer from GTM, let's say we've got an influencer from HR, and I can definitely see this as one of the trends that will, I think, pick up very soon, given especially in the remote scenario. And now that HRs have this another what can I say, pressure in a way to say, hey, I want to hire people from across the world as well. Now I want to hire people from, let's say, Philippines. I want to do this, I want to do
True.
that as well, right? So I think, yeah, this was a great conversation, Vikas. Thanks again for agreeing to be a part of this. Nisha, as usual, it was amazing to co-host this with you as well. We'll be back with another episode next week. So again, yeah, feel free to subscribe to this newsletter as well. We're going to be also sharing again snippets of this on our LinkedIn page as well. So make sure to follow our LinkedIn page. And if you want to get in touch with Vikas or either one of us, feel free to do that as well. We'll leave all his coordinates below as well. Again, any feedback on the podcast? Again, this is the very first season, so again, me and Nisha are not perfect. We're getting there step by step, brick by brick. So if there's any feedback that you would provide, even a nice testimonial as well, feel free to reach out to me and Nisha anytime. Thanks again. This was the Edge Podcast for CHROs. Bye bye. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.